We have people joining us from all different time zones. So good morning, good afternoon, and maybe even good evening from wherever you are joining us from today. I'm Siobhan Benita. I'm a former UK civil servant, and I'm delighted to be chairing this webinar on behalf of Global Government Forum, which is a publishing house that serves civil servants all around the world. So today's topic, making green the colour of government money. And in today's webinar, we'll be covering kind of issues all around how governments can really help to fund their net zero ambitions. So the types of things that we will be covering will be how governments are looking to fund the development of green infrastructure projects, how finance ministries and finance departments can incentivize or require that move to net zero using the tools available to them, so kind of tax and regulatory frameworks, for example, how governments can work with private financial institutions and central banks to realign investments towards global net zero goals, because government alone and the public sector can't achieve this on their own. So we're going to be hearing about those kind of issues today, and we've got three fantastic speakers with us who I will introduce in a moment, and I'm going to invite our speakers to give some opening comments. But this is very much your webinar and your opportunity to put your questions to our expert panel. So on whichever device you are using, you should have a Q&A button somewhere, a Q&A function. Please use that Q&A button at any point from now on to send in any questions or comments that you have, and we will get through as many of those as we can before the end of today's webinar. But let me introduce our fantastic speakers. So first, we will hear from Matthias Frumery, who is Climate Ambassador and Head of Delegation to the UNFCCC at the Climate Department in the Ministry of Climate and Enterprise in Sweden. Previously, Matthias has held several positions within the Ministry for Foreign Affairs, including postings in Budapest and Brussels. And he's also worked as an EU advisor in the Prime Minister's office in Sweden. Then we head over to Estonia, where we will hear from Aili Lepik, who is head of the Green Reform Department in the Ministry of Climate. Aili and her team are responsible for the coordination of the green transition there, and she also works on reducing the climate and environmental footprint of public institutions, including on things like green public procurement and greening public spending. And before joining the Ministry of Climate in October last year, Aili led work on Estonia's long-term national strategy, so that's Estonia 2035, which linked some of those national long-term goals to the government's strategic planning system and state budget. And then last, but by no means least, we will hear from Alessandra Scobi, who heads the Climate Finance Unit of the European Commission's Directorate General for Climate Action. Alessandra supports the reorientation of capital flows towards low greenhouse gas emissions and climate resilient development. And she has extensive experience in international climate change negotiations, with a focus on adaptation as well as minimizing and addressing loss and damage. And before joining the European Commission, she was Environmental Affairs Officer at the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, focusing on green and sustainable development in that continent. So I'm sure you'll agree with me, we really do have a fantastic panel with us here today, three very expert speakers. Please do take this opportunity to send in all of your questions. That will make the conversation really good once we've heard from our speakers. And on that note then, Matthias, I'm going to come over to you and invite you to give the first of our opening remarks.
Thanks so much, Siobhan, and thanks so much for this opportunity to join you at this occasion. Greetings from Sweden. I'll start with maybe sort of taking a look also at what we call our climate diplomacy and how we engage with countries globally in hopefully advancing climate action and the elements which we've designed as part of that climate diplomacy, and digging into a bit of finance as a part of that. So the three elements that we designed in our climate diplomacy very much also speak to sort of the experience that we have in Sweden in making our own transition. And those three elements are policy, finance, and technology. I mean, and it might speak to themselves in a way, saying that sort of what kind of elements would be necessary to drive climate action in a country and also globally, but then just sort of maybe digging a bit down into each of those. I mean, on the policy side, obviously, it's about how you implement the Paris Agreement in your national context. We have our national climate policy framework setting out our 2045 target when we will be net zero at the latest, and also a number of institutions which have been put in place to monitor the implementation of that climate policy framework. Secondly, then on finance, I'll come back to that. And then on technology is very much about the kind of solutions that, in our case, then Swedish business actors can offer to accelerate the transition, not only in Sweden, but also, of course, globally. And hopefully these three elements would also speak to each other and sort of create a kind of positive circle whereby once you accelerate your policy action, you would also create the demand for more innovative technology. And once that kind of technology is in place, you would also feel that you're confident in bringing of accelerating your policy action once again. And hopefully that's going to be sort of a virtuous circle in accelerating action. Now, on the finance side, it's also there three elements which we're working with, and maybe that sort of speaks more also to the topic of our webinar today. So firstly, what we try to do is integrate climate action within our national budget process. So when we have within the government offices, and at any time when we as sort of civil servants send in a budget proposal to our Ministry of Finance, we are requested to do three impact analysis, one on jobs and growth, one on gender, and one on climate and environment. Mm-hmm. And if those impact analyses are not part of our budget proposal, basically they will not be taken into account. So those three impact analyses need to be there. And of course, that's also a way of sensitizing ourselves, not only us within the Ministry of Climate and Enterprise, but also across ministries, that how does this particular budget proposal impact on climate and environment? And of course, it sort of brings you to make that kind of analysis for any kind of ministry, and also to create sort of a body of evidence within the government offices once the budget is presented as to what extent that particular budget goes in the direction of supporting climate action. So that's sort of the first part of our finance element. Mm-hmm. Secondly, on finance, we also, and this is sort of more on the international stage, we're integrating climate action within our development finance. So both sort of setting aside specific funds for climate action, but also trying to mainstream then climate action within our entire development portfolio. And also, of course, engaging then in dialogue with our partner countries to see how can we be supporting them in making that kind of prioritization and integrating climate action into sort of the dialogue that we have with our partner countries, as part of sort of how we set up our development finance and our development cooperation more generally. And of course, that also helps us to be better in responding to the kinds of needs and priorities that our developing country partners put forward, to see that sort of climate action is indeed part of the whole of government approach, and being able to sort of to see how does both sort of the integration part come in, any kind of development finance project that we're doing, whether it's in education, in health, or infrastructure, we can ensure that there is a climate aspect to that as well, and sort of to make that kind of risk assessment, as it were, in terms of how a particular project could be impacted by a changing climate, and also have a positive impact in terms of creating more resilience, and of course making sure that we're not increasing emissions as such. So that's sort of a key element also of our development finance, trying to make sure that we integrate both from our side, but also then supporting our partner countries in integrating climate action in the kind of priorities that they put forward. And thirdly, and I think I would say actually increasingly important for when it comes to finance or finance element of our climate diplomacy, is creating the kind of investment climate which attracts investment more generally. Mm-hmm. And that is, of course, from a government perspective, more, again, a regulatory exercise in just making sure that there is an investment climate in your country which attracts both domestic and international capital to the kind of investments that you need to make. And that could be and these of course are not sort of climate related, many of those kind of barriers which you need to work with. It could be everything from freedom from corruption, well-functioning institutions, rule of law, any kind of elements which makes it makes the investment safe from an investor point of view. And again, both from domestic investors and also from international investors. So what we try to bring to that kind of conversation, both sort of within our country, but also in conversations with our partner countries, is by having those these three elements as part of your national resource mobilization plan. Hopefully that could also accelerate that kind of national resource mobilization by firstly then integrating climate action within your budget process, making sure that you're integrating within your development finance, and then thirdly, creating that kind of regulatory environment which also makes for that attractive investment climate, which then hopefully would make your country a top destination for not only climate-related investments, but of course for investments generally, for you to be able to make those in a way which accelerates the kind of priorities which you want to pursue also when it comes to climate action. I'll stop there for the time.
Brilliant.
And look forward to the rest of the conversation. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Matthias. I mean, that's a brilliant way to start because you've really set the scene there. I think it was very interesting to hear what you said and how you set that out in terms of the Swedish perspective. So, as you said, the three foundations, I think, for climate action of policy, finance and technology. So finance being just as important as those other two areas. And then within the finance aspect, you've got there the three things that you mentioned. So embedding it in your national budget process, looking at the development finance and the development funds and how you work with your development partners. And then crucially as well, I think, as you said there, creating that good investment climate. Already, I've got lots of questions that I want to put to you on all of those things. So to the audience, if you've got any questions, please do start sending those in, but we'll hold those until we've heard from everybody. Thank you so much, Matthias. Great way for us to start. And Aili, I'm coming over to you now.
Thank you. And I'm happy to bring in Estonian perspective. And I think it's a crucial topic, how to make the government money green these days, because it's all about the huge goals that we have and huge targets that we have. And my question would be like, if you want to make the government money green, you have to ask, is the green among the government strategic goals? And that's a story I'm happy to show you, how to link those goals to the money and budget planning. And if you could put the next slide, please. In Estonia, we did this huge strategy process where we defined our long-term goals, national long-term goals. And this was the first time we did something like this that was adopted by the parliament, that it gave us overarching goals for all the all over the country, and 70,000 people participated. So it's almost everyone's paper. But it was adopted by the parliament in 2021, and it was the first document where it was stated at this high level that Estonia should be climate neutral by 2050. And it stated this, and it gives us a really solid basis for greening our actions. And the next slide, you can see that this strategy itself, it actually states 5 main goals, 5 strategic goals. And it was the first time also when economy was mixed together with this environmentally and socially responsible target, that the economy not only should be strong and innovative, but it should be also responsible towards people and towards environment. So it was also a big step for us that we had this stated in our really high level strategy. And that's the next level slide. You could also see that we also defined indicators. How do we know when we reach the targets? And with the help of Statistics Office, they created this tree of truths, so you can see how we are doing. We are quite in an autumn state right now, only a few green leaves, but this helps us to monitor how we are doing in approaching the targets as well. But it's not everything. This is usually where the strategy process ends, that you have the strategy, you have the goals, and you also maybe you define some indicators how to measure this. But it's not very often when people also or the public officials also think about implementation of the strategy. And if you could put the next slide, that during the strategy process, which lasted almost 2 years, we also throughout the process actually put a lot of effort in defining how this strategy will be implemented and how this strategy will change the landscape of strategic planning in Estonia. And that's a strategy. It says that all these long-term goals have to be taken into account in the state budget strategy and also in the preparation of government's action plan. I can explain it a little bit later what this is, but actually the government's action plan is the one that is guiding the government's action throughout their governing period. But this and we did put a lot of effort in it, because when we started the strategy process, we also kind of started a strategic planning reform in Estonia. And at the next slide, you can see where we ended up. The implementation mechanism is quite simple. We wanted to diminish the number of strategic documents in Estonia. It was strategy jungle when we started, but now it's quite clear that we have this long-term strategy, Estonia 2035, which is adopted by the parliament. So parliament gives us long-term goals. Then we have sectoral development plans, which are adopted by the government. And it's only like 17 of them now. It used to be like 30, but when our office started, then it was more than 100. So it's now clear that every main sector has its own plan, and that you can really orientate in this. And at the program level, this is a ministerial level, and this is the actually action plan for implementing the sectoral development plan. And the programs are linked to the state budget and state budget strategy. So there are also budget allocations, there are like deadlines, there are also indicators. And by this system, all these long-term goals are linked to the state budget. And there are two elements that are quite important. One is performance report, that from the program implementation, the government office and the Ministry of Finance get information how the long-term goals, among them green goals, are implemented and how they are doing. And also, as you see in the picture, you have the government action plan, which is a planning document for the government. And this is linked to the long-term goals as well and long-term development needs. Of course, you can ask when the new government will be there, whether they will have their work program also linked to the long-term goals. But we have embedded this action program in the system in a way that when they are designing the action program, at least they have to think how this fits into the long-term framework. And if the long-term framework is not fitting anymore, of course, they can start the changes in the framework. They can start the changes in the long-term strategy and start the process of changing the strategy, because the goals should, if you don't need the goals as such anymore, of course, you should be able to change those. But this action program actually is a concrete planning document that we haven't seen in lots of countries. And this connects the government's coalition agreement into concrete actions, concrete legal acts, concrete steps that the government has to do to reach their promises. So this is a picture, and at the next slide you can see this actually the same picture, how it runs every year from one month to other. And don't stop here, not really in a detail, but this is really how these long-term goals are embedded in our strategic system. But at the next slide, I would also say that I work in the Ministry of Climate now, and this is also a way how you can green a big portion of government's money. Actually, when the current government was formed, then they kind of used this legal government approach, and they mixed some departments from the Ministry of Economic Affairs to the Ministry of Environment that created the Ministry of Climate. And by doing that, they actually can gathered like 70-80% of green fields or the topics that are connected to our climate policy into one ministry. And I've been working there since October last year, and I'm really happy to see that when previously I worked in the government office with the Prime Minister, and I really saw how we had silos between some ministries, and now I can see how these silos are broken and how people are really working together and planning actions and planning their investments which are green and also implementing the climate policy in Estonia. And one example in next slide is the climate law, which is currently being drafted in Estonia. It's the first one for us. Most of the countries have them. We haven't had it. But it's a big step for us because we had the climate policy, we have the long-term strategy, but they are like strategies and they don't have the legal power as such. So now we're drafting this climate law, and we hope to be ready with this by the end of the year. And it's also giving this legal power to our climate goals. It also gives legal shares to every sector, who has to do what, who is responsible for doing what, how we will finance it, how will we monitor it, and also how we report it. So it's a really big step for us. But it's not the only thing. Of course, we deal with green public procurement, which is also greening the public money and really important element. And we also try to do the green investment coordination. And also, I really agree that creating this good investment environment for green investment is quite crucial thing. So besides setting the targets for the sector, our ministry also tries to figure out how to encourage green investments in Estonia, and we deal lots with this as well. But I can stop here. Of course, I have lot to do, but because the ministry has lots of topics, our office has lots of topics. But I will stop here, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have later.
Thanks so much, Ellie. I can hear the passion for this in your voice, and that there's so much more we can discuss when we get onto the Q&A. And one of the things already, because both you and Matthias have touched on that investment climate, making sure it's as conducive to investment as possible. So we might come back to that when we get into the Q&A. But some of the things that really struck me about what you said there is how that you've really built the greening of kind of everything into this Estonia 2035 strategy. And you mentioned there are lots of things, again, that we can unpick. So some of the key things, linking it to budget allocations, linking it to long-term planning, having not just a great strategy, but really concrete implementation and action plans to make it a reality. And then also mentioning the importance of having the legislative framework that kind of binds this into the way even future maybe administrations will act, and then also bringing in the importance of governance. So as you said, they're creating this new ministry has an impact on the funding arrangements, which has also had a big shift in what people can do. Thank you so much again. Lots and lots of food for thought there already. Alexandra, I'm coming over to you.
Thank you very much, Siobhan, and good day to everyone. It's a great pleasure to have an opportunity to share with the many participants online and with my fellow panelists a few thoughts on how investments can be mobilized to support the transition to net zero and climate neutrality as soon as possible. So let me get right to it. We've heard the experiences and approaches of Sweden and Estonia. What I'd like to do is maybe to take us to the global context and see where we fit in this picture, and then provide a couple of examples of how we at the European Union level are trying to unleash, if you wish, the power of private investments to take us to our climate neutrality objectives by mid-century. And I guess our starting point as we speak today is really the outcomes of COP28 in Dubai, which perhaps unexpectedly were extremely successful from our perspective in setting and resetting, if you wish, the ambition in terms of climate mitigation. In particular, of course, the urgency of keeping the 1.5 alive was very much highlighted, and we do need to keep this on track. But what we also see in the outcomes of COP28 is a firm commitment by all leaders to implement, if you wish, or embark upon transformations that can put us firmly on the path to climate neutrality. A couple that I believe are worth mentioning in the context of today's discussion are, of course, the commitment to phasing down unabated coal power, transitioning away from fossil fuels in the energy system so that we can achieve net zero by 2050, and of course, tripling the renewable energy capacity and doubling global rate of energy efficiency by 2030. And I think these are all important political commitments that give clarity and certainty about the future development pathways at the global level. And as such, they will have a positive impact on investment and help investors make decisions that are aligned with the objectives of the Paris Agreement and ultimately achieve climate neutrality. I think we have seen, quite a lot of assessments of what the investments needs are at the global and regional level to meet the ambition of the Paris Agreement. One of the latest reports from the Climate Policy Initiative, for instance, highlights that we need to increase climate finance by at least 5 times if we are to meet the challenges, the investment challenges that we see. And even if climate finance globally has more than doubled in the last biennium, reaching 1.3 trillions, and half of that is actually from the private sector, we still have a huge investment gap. And I think we see the same in Europe, where we have also an investment gap to meet the current mitigation ambition and for 2030 and of course 2050. I think in our latest report, we see an annual private and public investment gap of nearly 500 billion euros in the EU. And in the latest communication setting out the recommendation of the European Commission and Union for 2040 emission reduction targets, we see that there is going to be an increase in investment needs beyond 2030, both in the energy sector, but also in transport, as well as other economic sector. And of course, the bulk of these investments will have to come from the private sector. I think there is a role to play for governments, as both Matthias and Eili have set out, both in terms of enabling environment, but also using public capital to mobilize investment and advanced technologies. But clearly, we need to see much more movement of investments from brown to green, phasing out and replacing carbon-intensive assets, for instance, with low carbon ones. I think we have also seen that globally, we don't actually have a shortage in capital. The challenge is making sure that the capital flows to the green transition and to climate neutrality investments. And because of many barriers, including policy and regulatory barriers, we do not see that happening with the speed that we need in order to keep 1.5 alive. Maybe a couple of words on how we in the EU perceive and see the role of governments, including and the European Union, in helping mobilize private capital. And I think there are 2 key ingredients that we see, and this resonates very much with what Matthias and Eili have said before me. First, we do need political vision and policies that drive the ambition. So we need to see domestic, clear climate targets and policies. And second, we need a set of incentives and disincentives, in particular targeting private actors, but also an enhancement in transparency around what are the corporate risks and opportunities that private investors need to take into account. So Matthias talked about mainstreaming climate into government budgets. We need to make sure that we achieve a moment where climate decisions and considerations are also mainstreamed into private actors' financial decisions. And to do that in the EU, of course, we have a clear set of laws and legislations that are setting out the direction of travel in a very clear and unambiguous manner. The Fit for 55, of course, the European climate law overall that sets the political framework in a legal manner under the European Green Deal, but also the Fit for 55 package that unpacks the different sectoral targets to 2030. As I mentioned, we recently published our recommendations for targets for 2040 that would bring further clarity to investors on where the investment needs to go. And these are the legal frameworks that really send a very strong, clear signal in terms of where investments has to be and should and are already influencing investment decisions within the EU. And the other ingredient in the terms of incentives and disincentives is around our sustainable finance framework and strategy. I think this, is coming to completion. It is really a framework to provide tools and instruments that can help corporates in aligning their decisions with climate policies and ultimately with the objectives of the Paris Agreement. Under the strategy, so the sustainable finance strategy, for instance, we have a new taxonomy that provides a definition of what is a truly sustainable economic activity. And since June last year, we have completed the taxonomy framework to cover all the environmental objectives, including, of course, mitigation and adaptation. And I think importantly, the European taxonomy has also a do no significant harm provision that makes sure we enhance coherence across the different objectives we want to achieve. I mean, resources are always scarce, whether public or private, so we need to make sure we can achieve more than one objective with the same euro or dollar that we invest. So the taxonomy is really a compass, if you wish, to define what is green investment and how corporates and investors at the different levels, as well as banks, can actually use it to this end. We do need, to make it, to see how it works, make it more friendly, updating perhaps the criteria for technology improvement. This is of course not a done deal, but it's a very good first step, and we see already some benefits to it. The flip side of the coin is of course the need to improve transparency and accountability of private sector to help investors make better informed decisions. And we do that through requirements of corporate disclosures in the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, where starting this year, the largest companies and progressively SMEs will have to start reporting on their environmental sustainability aspects, and of course also more disclosure for investors through the Sustainable Finance Disclosures Regulation that is in place since 2022. The last piece of the puzzle is the corporate sustainability due diligence, which is still under discussion, and where our proposal would take us a step further by requiring the largest corporation to consider due diligence, including on climate and environmental aspects, if material, in their whole supply chain. And this also would help transition internationally. And I think, these are all new instruments, so it's hard at the time to measure the actual impact on reallocation of capital flows, but anecdotal evidence and the feedback we receive from businesses, industries, and banks is actually quite positive. So we're really looking forward to the full implementation. So maybe if I can conclude with a couple of highlights on how this is reflected at the international level. And I think we've seen that, sustainable finance has increasingly become part of mainstream discussions, certainly in the EU, but also around the world. And we see jurisdictions everywhere putting in place policies and incentives to shift investments from the private sector towards green, let's say, and then of course the awareness of the climate crisis and of business opportunities certainly play a key role. The EU is and has been a first mover in this field, and I think our work has really inspired many partners to develop sustainable finance regulations in the UK, in the US, for instance, but more broadly in the context of the G20. And one instrument that we do use to, if you wish, exchange experiences and good practices with our partners is the International Platform on Sustainable Finance that has at the moment around 20 members, and it's a multilateral, plurilateral forum for dialogues between policymakers who are working towards or have developed sustainable finance regulatory measure, so that we can be sure that there is interoperability across the different framework, because at the end of the day, we want to minimize, if you wish, the burden on the private sector and businesses that operate across different jurisdictions. And of course, I think it's important to highlight that these 20 members of the IPSF, the International Platform on Sustainable Finance, do represent almost 60% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And so it's not negligible if we manage to have interoperable frameworks that can actually foster investments from the private sector. So it's quite encouraging to see that countries more and more are moving in the same direction, because this is a necessary piece to mobilize the shift in investments that we need to see. I'll stop there for the time being. Thank you very much.
Alessandra, thank you so much. I said that one of the things I wanted to get into more detail was how do you create that, how do you enable that environment for investment? And you've really helped us there with some of the details you've gone into. But just going back, a couple of things that struck me. You mentioned how big that gap is still in terms of how much private finance we do need to raise to make sure that between all of us we meet our climate goals. So I think you mentioned there in the EU alone a gap of 500 billion euros that we're going to need to find. And then the importance of that kind of global leadership, so as you say in COP28, showing that commitment, the ongoing commitment to achieving net zero in 2050 and transitioning away from fossil fuels. So that certainty on the future is so important for that investment going forward. And then you mentioned some of the other kind of factors that would be really important. And I think we can come on to those in the questions in a moment. So having that clear political vision and policies in place, having the right incentives and disincentives in place, and more transparency around what some of the risks are, the legal framework being really important, but also really interesting what you said there about the taxonomy and just the kind of definition of what is green investment, and kind of making sure that that's coherent both within a country, but also, as you mentioned there as well, that there is kind of coherence across international borders as well. Really important for big investment in a lot of these things. And nice to hear as well, as you said there, that just the conversation around sustainable finance now has become much more mainstreamed. So I get a kind of positive sense from all of you, which is really nice when we're talking about climate action, that we are moving in the right direction and things are moving in the right direction. But I'll be interesting to hear what our audience thinks about this. So I do want to come back to all of you. Thank you so much for your opening remarks. I'm going to kick off with a question or two of my own, but I can see we've already got questions coming in. But I just want to this issue of kind of creating the right enabling environment for investment and having that certainty in place. Do you think governments around the world are getting this right, or is there more that they could be doing to create this, the kind of perfect environment for investment? And I'm just thinking in particular in terms of a lot of the recovery plans that have been put in place post the pandemic, for example. Did we do enough? Did governments do enough to make sure that in those recovery plans, the kind of green finance aspects were built in as part of those recovery plans? Matthias, you are nodding on all of that. I'm going to come back to you to kick off on this question.
Thanks. Well, I think the easy answer to that question on the recovery plans is no. We didn't go as far as we could have gone in that respect. I mean, I remember UNSG Antonio Guterres already at the start of the pandemic, when sort of the first kind of recovery packages were were coming in, making that appeal to countries. Let's make best use of these funds to make sure that we can actually not only sort of keep the worst consequences of the pandemic at bay, but also use those funds to make sure that we accelerate the transition. And we didn't. I think it was, is the verdict. I mean, I can't remember the exact figures now, but in the height of these pandemic recovery programs, I think there were some 15, 16, maybe 17,000 billion, so 16 trillion US dollars being put aside, predominantly in G20 countries, but still. And I think it's just sort of a small portion of those which are actually geared towards the transition or the green transition. So we should have done much better. And there were opportunities there which maybe weren't sort of being taken on board to the extent they could have been. From the EU side, I mean, Alexander will know more about this, but we managed to, in the recovery funds we set up within the EU, they were geared both towards the green and the digital transition. So I think we made a good attempt, and of course the work is still ongoing in making best use of those funds. But I think also there is maybe somewhat of an untapped potential in making sure that we bring these two transitions even closer together. I mean, the green transition is very much dependent on the digital transition. So from a green perspective, we have every interest in making sure that the digital transition actually accelerates as well. And I think Estonia here is a very good example of also the digital transition and sort of how you're making best use of the digital services within your society. So definitely there can be more done in making sure that whatever kind of both sort of these kind of recovery packages are being best geared towards the green and the digital transition, but also more generally to supporting each other in making sure that we again integrate climate action in our national public spending plans.
Thanks. Well, Aili, I'll come over to you because, as Matthias said, Estonia is known for all things digital. Do you think that more could have been done in your kind of recovery plans to build in some of these greener issues?
If I take this general question, whether governments around the world are doing enough, then my definite answer will be they can do more. They can always do more. Even working in a government, I know that we can do more. And I believe that the government should be role models here. And what concerns the recovery plans, you can also do more there, but I'm happy that the European Commission was quite set quite strict rules there that there should be green targets in there, and there should be concrete target in there. So I think the recovery plans are quite green, at least in Estonia, they are quite green, and you have lots of green and climate related investments in there. My concern is that maybe we should be quicker in implementing those plans and making these investments in a quicker way. So in lots of countries, the plan is there, but the investments are still waiting. So I think this is also one step where the governments can speed up a little bit, of course, according to all rules. But this is also in the hand of the governments. But there is also one aspect that I want to bring in, and why I believe that the governments should and could do more is green public procurement. If you consider that approximately quarter of the public procurement is around quarter of the country's GDP, and if this is not spent for the green issues, and if this is not spent according to the green and climate targets and goals, this is not making an impact. And this is kind of unused tool for the governments, because I believe that the government themselves should be role models, and government institutions should be role models in climate and green actions. So there is a tool how they can make government money green, and this is green public procurement, and thinking what they spend money on and how they spend money on, and by encouraging by using green public procurement, they also could encourage green investments and green private sector services, green private sector products. And it's in a kind of easy circle how you can promote green investments also in your country, besides just subsidies and giving giving support in other ways. So government has lots of tools that they can use, and I feel that not all the governments are using those enough yet. But luckily, we know what to do, and even in Estonia, we try to improve this environment and raise the level of green public procurement and also speed up the green investments in our country. So this is
it's
my feeling.
interesting what you say there about green public procurement, because we do webinars just on that issue, and it is interesting how different countries are trying to factor in sustainability requirements into awarding contracts. But it goes back, I think, to what Alessandra was saying about how do you provide certainty for businesses on how you're going to measure some of those things as well. And I think you're absolutely right that much more could be done because so much money is accounted for in terms of government spending. Alessandra, I want to come back to you because both Matthias and Ailey have kind of praised the EU approach to the recovery packages. I'm thinking of Ailey's kind of tree of life there in terms of how green do you think the leaves would be on your tree if you were going to mark the countries, the member states of the EU in terms of how much they did actually use this as an opportunity to promote greener finance?
Thanks. I'm not going to give you a ranking of our member states. What I can say is that indeed we did take, I mean, I think the European Green Deal was faced with a lot of geopolitical challenges. Of course, COVID-19, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia that challenged our energy system. And I think it has proven extremely resilient. And I think that's a key message that I think we should emphasize also to our partners. So when it comes to the Recovery and Resilience Facility, we have tried to the extent possible to use it to set the stage for the long-term path. And indeed, we have a target of a minimum of 37% of the Recovery and Resilience Facility overall budget to be spent on climate action specifically. But also we have provisions of do no harm. So everything has to be aligned with the goal of meeting climate neutrality by 2050. And as Ailey was saying, many of our member states are actually doing much more than the 37%, which is the minimum requirement, because there is a business case to be made. Of course, there's always winners and losers, as we've seen in the last couple of weeks in Europe with the many protests of the agriculture sector, for instance. Some of them are quite vocal, but overall there are opportunities that many see and want to take, and it is the role of governments at the different levels, including at the local level, to make sure that such opportunities are highlighted and they can be exploited and harnessed by individuals and investors alike.
Well, that leads us on actually to probably the first question that's coming from Sarah Honeybone. And Alessandra, I'll shake up the order a bit, so I'll come to you first on this one, because Sarah says for Matthias and Ailey, but I want to ask you as well your thoughts on this. It says sometimes it feels like everyone is just shouting over each other and no one can agree on anything. I think that's a genuine, frustration that a lot of people feel on a lot of issues at the moment. How do you involve the general public in the development of your country's approaches and distill a range of different views into a coherent way forward? Is there broad public support for climate-friendly policies in your countries? So Matthias and Ailey, I will come to you on this because it's very much about a national government perspective. But Alessandra, you did touch on there the importance, you mentioned the kind of farmers, for example, who are protesting at the moment. Is there more, do you think, that national governments could be doing in the communication side of things, as inevitably some of these policies are going to impact on people's lives?
I think so. I mean, let me start with the EU level, perhaps. I mean, in our European energy and climate governance regulation, we do explicitly call for countries to set a consultative platform to design their national energy and climate plans, because it is critical to hear everybody's view. I mean, the just part of the climate transition cannot be ignored. It's certainly critical, and leaving no one behind is one of the core principles principles of the European Green Deal. That doesn't always make for easy conversations across the different counterparts, and there has to be a genuine willingness to listen to each other and try to find a compromise and possible solutions. But I think until now we have seen that it is possible, and sometimes I think the reaction of citizens and businesses are all understandable and justified. What is needed from governments is to not to hide some of the difficult facts. Of course, there's going to be changes, but these changes can be and have to be accompanied by policies that can soften, if you wish, the negative impact. And we shouldn't lose sight of what the end game is, but also we need to take into account, and governments can and are already doing that. And I think the Repower EU process and how it has implemented in the member states clearly shows that governments can accompany citizens through challenging times that at the end of the day lead us to a better position.
So having both good communication but also support in place, especially for the most vulnerable who are going to be impacted hard. Aili, so you mentioned very much in terms of your strategy, your Estonia 2035, that you this was a conversation almost with everybody. Do you feel like the public are behind you now in your transition plans?
Yeah, great question. Of course, I hope everyone is on board, but the truth is not everyone is on board. And it's the same in Estonia, that some of them people really strongly believe that we need to act and we need to do something on climate policy, and we need to be strong and we need to be really quick and act quickly. And but of course there are people who are not who don't understand the issue, who don't believe in it, and they see only the negative part of it. And there is a lot of work that the governments can do. Of course, one is raising public awareness, because sometimes people just don't understand what it is, how it affects their everyday life. Do they have jobs afterwards when the green transition is done? Do we still have economy going on? Because there are lots of people who say that everything will collapse when we do the green transition here. And we have to explain that not everything will collapse. And that's what we are trying to do right now with also the climate law and drafting the climate law. When we were drafting the long-term strategy, we really, I'm a strong believer of open government, that we did everything openly and everybody could discuss, send us recommendations. And I'm happy to see that with drafting the climate law, a similar approach is there. Most of the partner organizations are in the working groups, so they're discussing the topics together with the partner organizations. And you can really explain what this law is, what the climate issues is, what the targets is, what does it mean for our economy, what does it mean to our sectors. But also right now we are starting this campaign that everybody in Estonia can discuss the issues and can also send recommendations to the climate law. So, and there will be fact sheets, there will be explanatory materials, and we're trying to reach out to people and of course collect their thoughts, but also explain what does it mean to them when we act, and also what does it mean when we don't act. What can the consequences be then when we don't act and when we don't do anything? So the raising of the awareness is crucial, and of course it starts from the childhood. Environmental education at schools, green I don't know what the word here is, but at the universities also green skills you have to teach, and then that's where the understanding comes. But I don't have the exact numbers right now, what's the support for our climate policy and green policy is, but I'm sure it's not 100% in Estonia, and we have to deal with this. And we, of course, we have to explain what does it mean to different counterparts and gain their support as well. And we have to deal with the negative consequences as well and see how we deal with them, and not kill the economy here in Estonia with this green transition.
Thanks. You're kind of setting out there how complicated some of this is. It's not straightforward. Matthias, the same question to you. Kind of your thoughts on the broad level of public support for what it is you're trying to do.
I think our sense is that we've come to a place in the transition both sort of within countries in Europe and globally, where the impacts are being felt more clearly, both by individual, by societies, by companies, which of course calls for the kind of actions which both Alessandra and Eili have spoken about, sort of the necessity of designing policies, not only communicating, but also designing policies in a way which cater to those kind of concerns or impacts which then individuals and societies and companies would have. I mean, I guess one case in point in many European countries, at least, is high petrol prices. And how do you design your policy in a way which then would speak to the needs or necessities you would have in a policy design to accelerate climate action, but at the same time then make sure that those kind of high costs are not sort of being borne in a way which sort of affects parts of the population, maybe in a way which is not being felt as it's just. And that, of course, also speaks to the concept of just transition, which we're hearing more and more about. There's even a just transition work program within the UNFCCC, the global negotiations, which then intends to sort of to share these kind of examples between countries and how you are designing your policies in a way which then also speak to those kind of concerns. But also when it comes to communications, I mean, there is a commitment also in the Paris Agreement of what we call action for climate empowerment, and exactly that, sort of embedding climate action within education, raising awareness to make sure that there is an acceptance for the kind of policies which are being put in place. But I think ultimately it is also about that kind of leadership to be shown at various levels of society in terms of how you can alleviate whatever kind of impacts there are for those policies that need to be set in place, and make sure that, again, that everyone is on board and everyone has a place in the new economy.
Thanks. So bringing us back a little bit more to the kind of the money and the financing issue itself. So Renee Marikin has asked about standards for sustainable financing, and in particular, are there international efforts on standards that might, for example, mitigate against some of the greenwashing that we're seeing? So I think this goes to your point, Eili, about if you're awarding contracts for public procurement for companies who are claiming to be green, or your point, Alessandra, about what is green finance and what isn't it. Do we have robust standards in place where we can make sure that actually the subsequent activity is actually helping towards hitting our net zero targets? Eili, I'll start with you. Do we have sufficient standards in place?
I'm sure Alessandra is the best person to answer here, but I believe at least in European Union, we have done a lot of work to get those standards, to define what is green, what is not, what is environmentally friendly. That's why we have the taxonomy. We have different directives and regulations that are concerning the green standards. And the standards are there. I can say that the standards are there, but of course we have to help the private sector to understand those standards, and because sometimes I feel they are a little bit lost in between those standards, especially small and medium-sized enterprises, and that's the same as a public sector, as general public, that you have to explain what those are. You have to maybe help to create some toolkits that they can orient between those standards, and they can do their part in the standards, and they would understand what the standards are. But there are also some concerns from my personal side with those standards, that sometimes the standards are maybe too green or dark green, and the money is turning dark green for the enterprises and the big investment banks who follow the taxonomy and the standards, their loans and financial services are turning too green, and then some enterprises who are in the transitional phase, they are in trouble in getting into the transition, because you can't change yourself by overnight. And sometimes I feel that the standards definitely help. I'm really happy that they're there. And we have lots of directive now. A new directive is also regulation is being negotiated that is concerning the greenwashing as well. But sometimes that I feel that the enterprises and the private sector just needs little support in implementing all this. And that's what we
Interesting.
are also thinking here how to do and how to help them, because I'm really happy that the standards are there.
Thanks. Alessandra, I'm going to come to you next, but because Matthias, when I come to you, I want to bring in the international dimension of this because you mentioned it in your opening remarks. But Alexandra, how would you respond, one, to the question, but also to what Ailey said there about maybe actually in some instances, it's there are standards and actually maybe we're too green and that's not helpful either for businesses trying to make the transition?
Yeah, two parts to this question indeed. I mean, I think within the EU, we certainly recognize the risk of greenwashing and the need to substantiate the claims that companies make, and that's why we have been working both on the taxonomy but also on the disclosure aspect of companies, as Ailey has mentioned, and we are, through working on disclosure and making sure that companies report on similar aspects using a standardized methodologies, you can actually fight, if you wish, greenwashing and create a level playing field. We are also working, as Ailey mentioned, on a green claims directive that will further improve our transparency and eliminate misleading environmental messaging in the EU. This will apply to the EU, but clearly it will have an impact, as we've seen for the taxonomy and many other policies that the EU has developed. It will have an impact on companies that operate outside the EU borders as well. And I think that's an important piece of the puzzle. There is work that is happening at the international level on standards. So you have the International Sustainability Standard Board, for instance, that is working around some of the sustainability standards for companies. The standards that we are developing in the EU are compatible with the ISSB standards, but we think they're more ambitious because they require more disclosure and transparency. Now, to come to Ailey's last point, I think to me, it's not so much an issue of the standards being too green. It's an issue of there being a gap, if you wish, that hasn't been developed so much, and that's the issue of transition financing. And indeed, it was quite topical even at COP28, because everybody, we started, I think, from the easier part. So how do we define green? And now we need to move to the more difficult part. How do we accompany those transitioning from brown to green? How do we ensure that transition plans can be assessed and are credible and reliable, so that we can actually with confidence say that to investors, yes, you can invest to support this transition plan because it makes sense and it is aligned and it's to the contribution that this company has to make to achieve climate neutrality by 2050. So that's an area that is partly addressed in the taxonomy, but is not fully developed, where the Commission has released some guidance or recommendations last year, but where we under the next Commission are planning to work much more so that we can indeed provide this certainty for investors and these incentives for companies to really put in place a transition finance, which indeed is certainly necessary.
Thanks, Alexandra. So Matthias, the way I want to phrase this question to you, so obviously we've talked about, for example, building in green kind of objectives into public procurement, kind of domestic public spending. You mentioned as well, part of your finance side was making sure that your development finance and development funds also took into account conversations with your development partners about their own green agenda as well. But how easy is that to measure when you're yet again that one stage even further removed? How do you know that that money is being used in a way that's helping to meet net zero goals?
Well, I mean, partly our own assessment builds on a system we have within the OECD DAC, where we have what we call RIO markers to measure the extent to which our development finance is being used for those kind of measures. So it's a set of criteria which have been developed within the OECD to support us in sort of making that kind of accounting basically. But then, of course, we as a development finance partner, we want to be responsive to the kinds of needs and priorities that our development our development partners put forward. And ultimately, it will be within their own national accounting systems that will be sort of presenting the kind of results that also our development finance can provide in terms of meeting their own national targets. But also sort of on this particular topic, I think it's interesting to see on when it comes to taxonomies, for example, that Singapore and the ASEAN group of countries have developed not only what they call a green taxonomy, but what they call a transition taxonomy. So sort of giving that kind of financial cover, as to so to speak, for investors in that region to be more engaged also in the transition. For example, many countries in that region would have a high dependency on coal power for their energy and electricity. And in order for investors to feel secure in sort of financing the transition away from coal, they designed that transition taxonomy sort of to make that part of, to make sort of that kind of investment also being seen as a part of the package in going green within that region, which is of course, it's another way of designing your policies and your approach in order to incentivize those kind of investments. But I think also there are a range, which is encouraging. There is a range of various types of international initiatives where both countries and private actors are coming together to develop standards and set sort of compare best practices when it comes to policy development. So we have the coalition of finance ministers for climate action, for example, which is working on a range of various issues, from public procurement to, again, integrating climate action in your national budget processes to carbon pricing. We have also the Network for Greening the Financial System, with a number of central banks and financial supervisory authorities being members, on how central banks can be supporting this the transition. We have the Glasgow Alliance the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, which was launched at COP26 with a number of financial actors sort of within insurance, banks, and pension funds, for example, where companies are coming together to set these kind of targets and, again, sort of sharing best practice in terms of how they can be working to accelerate their transition to net zero. And also, I mean, I think Alexandra partly mentioned this, from the Swedish Financial Services Authority, for example, we've been engaged in developing global standards for sustainability disclosure, which were also launched just about a year ago, where then financial actors and business more generally can make best use of those disclosure requirements in creating also comparability between jurisdictions globally in terms of how the kind of actions that you need to take. So there's a lot of work going on. Sometimes my sense is that there are too many different types of initiatives engaged in this. So we need to also make sure that we're sort of all moving in the same direction.
Thanks, Matthias. I've just looked at the time and I can't believe how quickly our conversation has gone. So we've just got time for one final question. This question came in advance, and interesting, you've all spoken very positively about some of those international platforms and international collaborations and cross-sector collaborations now where good practice is being shared. But the question that came in before was, to what extent are internal arrangements, internal funding and finance arrangements, a barrier to meeting net zero targets? So, for example, are finance ministries doing enough in their allocation of money out to other departments, for example, to help as much as they could be helping governments to achieve their net zero targets? And it's interesting that you are all speaking from climate ministries rather than the finance or ministries in your country. So my final, I guess, question, and we'll have to keep the comments quite short. Ailey, you mentioned some of this in terms of you've created the new department, which has shifted the funding flows. And I think, Matthias, you said the green issues are being built into impact assessments. But my question to all of you is, what more would you want to see domestically in terms of those arrangements for how money flows to help meet the net zero targets? Alexandra, I'll start with you, because obviously you're not sat in a national government, but you do have that overview perspective. What more would you like to see countries doing?
I think, I mean, honestly, the Green Deal and how it has been declined in the different countries has really helped to break the silos. And even though around the table today you have representatives of climate ministries, as Matthias has said, there are more than 190 ministers of finance who are part of the coalition of finance ministers for climate who have an ambitious agenda. So I think we're seeing that this is moving in the right direction. And I mean, I think what we need to see more is coordination platforms domestically, both in the EU and outside. I think we have made progress, but we're not there fully yet. There's often trade-offs that need to be honestly assessed. And at the end of the day, the vision has to be driven by policy and by a political vision, because that is the basis on which you then can take decisions, and of course guided by science, and the science is quite clear, as Matthias was saying at the very beginning.
Thanks, Alexandra. Ailey, your thoughts on what more you can do nationally?
Yeah, I'm quite happy to say that our Ministry of Finance is also a strong believer of our national strategy, because we designed this implementation together with them. So these long-term goals are linked to the public state budget planning. But there is also two sides with the government money. One is planning, so you can do green budget planning. And I'm happy to know that the Ministry of Finance is also starting a project on green state budget and green budgeting in Estonia, how to link our national budget even more to the green goals. But the other side of the government money is spending, and there the green public procurement, that actually the value-based public procurement is an opportunity. And here also our Ministry of Finance is doing huge steps, but there is also more to be done. And the other one is investment planning. And when they do their investments plan, do they account green targets as well? And sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. And that's but I feel that the Ministry of Finance could do, and they have a huge role in state budget planning and how the budget planning system is built, and who can decide what, and who can what kind of input is taken into account. So there is a big role in the Ministry of Finance, definitely.
Thanks, Ellie. Matthias, we started with you, so I'm going to give you the final word on this.
Well, I think also it depends a bit on sort of the extent of the urgency you're confronted with. I mean, I've heard examples from African countries, for example, where they allocate maybe 20% of their national budget for climate adaptation issues, because that is such an immediate measure which they need to be, which they are confronted with. We have colleagues from the Caribbean states where they are hit being more frequent and more intense storms, and one single storm can wipe out 50% of their GDP. So of course, for those countries, I think it's even more at the core of the kind of budget work and planning that they're doing. From a Swedish perspective, we actually put in place the in our climate policy action plan, which each government needs to bring forward at the start of their term. This government included a measure to explore to the extent that we could be even more sort of rigorous in our budget design, where we would not only sort of measure the impact on the economy of a certain budget measure, but also how that impacts the state of our emissions. So that kind of metric would then need to be brought into the budget proposals themselves, going beyond the kind of impact analysis which I described initially. So that's something which we're exploring now to see to the extent that sort of could be us working even more closely together with our colleagues in the Ministry of Finance to see how our budget measures are being sort of seen in that light as well.
Brilliant. Thank you so much to all of you. I really like it when we have a conversation about climate issues that's actually got a lot of positive messages in there. So a lot of positives about what is being done. Crucial how the money and the funding is being utilised to help meet the net zero targets, and also that importance of just creating that environment for the public sector that's going to be so vital in this to come in and help on the investment side. Thank you so much to Alexandra, to Matthias, and to Ailey for giving us so much of your time and your expertise today. Really, really good conversation. To our audience, thank you for sending in your questions. And just to say, we will have sent you a very short questionnaire. If you don't mind just taking a couple of minutes minutes to complete that questionnaire. It just means we can keep giving you the webinars that are of most interest and value to you. So I would really appreciate that. We will be sending a link of the video to everybody who watched today and everybody who registered, so you can watch it all again and you can share it with any of your colleagues who you think would find this useful as well. And there will be an article in a couple of weeks' time with all of the key issues that were raised today. But thank you from me. Thank you once again to our brilliant panel, and I hope to see you all again soon on one of our other webinars. Thanks for now, everybody. Goodbye.
Thanks.